Hey, what's up guys? My name is Gareth from Simple Studios, the only game studio dedicated to your success, and in this episode, we're going to be starting a brand new series all about ChaosCards, my brand new card game that's a playable shitpost where nothing is balanced and everything beats everything. Let's get into it. And in this episode, we're going to be talking all about the metrics that I use when I design a deck for my card game to hopefully give you guys an insight on how to make some banger card game stuff for your card games, or just to be, better at making card game stuff in general. Anyways, let's dive into the first metric that I take a look at. When does the deck come online? And this might sound like gibberish, but hear me out here. This is essentially a way for us to determine when is the deck at its most powerful. Is it strongest in the early game? Is it strongest in the mid game, late game, or hyper late game? Early game decks tend to have a lot of focus on very cheap monsters and spells because in the early game, you don't have a whole lot of mana to spend on monsters and spells. So if you have a bunch of very cheap units, and a bunch of cheap spells, you're able to very easily overwhelm your opponent and take over the game just like that. Whereas mid-game cards, they are more powerful than early-game cards, but they have an increased cost, so typically they want to drag the game out until the mid-game and then cripple you with a few turns and then dominate from then on. And finally, the late game. They have the best of both worlds. They have the strongest monsters and they have the strongest effects, and it's not even close. Some late game monsters can wipe an entire board of early to mid game monsters on their own. But the challenge is that they actually have to support the mana cost or the summoning conditions that these monsters or spells have. And that's generally how it goes. A late game monster might require 10 mana and 5 allies to die in order for it to be summoned, let alone attack or use its effect. There's tons of stuff that we can do, and we'll be diving into that in subsequent videos in this series, but for now, let's take a look at our next metric. How many units are ideal? And this, again, might sound gibberish, but let me explain. This is essentially a way for us to determine how many units are needed to pull off the optimal combo. So if we take an early game deck like the Hustlers, they have Hustle, which allows them to attack on the turn that they are played. The Hustlers typically want to make use of their naturally high attack stat and their low health stat to overwhelm the opponent and kill off key monsters before they have a chance to retaliate. The Hustlers can do this on their own because a vast majority of Hustler cards already have Hustle, and their optimal combo is being able to attack on the turn that they're played. So you only need one monster to pull off the optimal combo for the Hustlers. Whereas if you take something like the Chronically Online archetype, which we will probably cover in this episode, generally you will need 4 to 5 to 6 monsters to pull off the stronger combos, and then for late game decks like the Cursed Kingdom or the Forbidden Gods, you will need easily a field of 9, 10, maybe even 12 units to actually pull off some devastating combos. And next up, how does the deck play? And again, this is going to be a little bit gibberish, but there's 4 main types that I like to use. There are more, but I might dive into them into a later episode. But the 4 main types are Aggression, Defensive, Utility, and Counter. Aggression typically refers to having the deck put a lot of its power budget into monsters, like the Hustlers, for example. They have very strong early game units, but not very powerful spells, or really any powerful effects, or anything that can really help them scale into the mid or late game. Basically, every turn that an aggression deck hasn't won, it lowers their chances of winning as the game goes on. Defensive decks are the polar opposite, because the longer the game goes on, the higher chances a defensive deck will win. And like I mentioned before, the Cursed Kingdom and Forbidden God decks are very defensive decks. They have some crazy powerful units and some crazy powerful effects, but in order to actually get to that state, you have to make sure that you don't die for the first 15 turns, and maybe even 20 turns in some cases. Utility decks typically focus on the mid-game because at that point, you have a little bit of mana to spend on both monsters and spells, and you can start to look at crippling your opponent by locking out certain monsters of combat, or just empowering monsters overall to make them unstoppable for 1 or 2 turns. And Counter is basically the same as Utility, but much more reactive, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So next up, what is the theme? And this is not really super important, but it is good if you understand the kind of cards that you're making. And this theme could be memes, dragons, ninjas, wizards, whatever it is, that's how you determine what cards you make. Like if my theme is wizards, I'll make an Archmage, Hydromancer, Pyromancer, Venomancer, whatever, right? Because those are all mages, they all inherit the same kind of, not necessarily aesthetic, but they all feel like they are a part of one archetype because they all share a similar theme. And moving into the mechanical theme, These are different from the deck playstyles. Now, every deck has a bunch of playstyles like aggression, defense, utility, and counter, but the way that you do it determines the mechanical theme. So let's take aggression, for example. How do you do aggression? Do you just attack relentlessly? Do you buff up your units' attacks so that they kill everything in one shot? Do you debuff enemy health pools so they're easier to kill? Do you attack before the round starts? After combat? When out of combat? During the draw phase? Whatever, right? It all depends how you do it, and that's the mechanical theme. Generally, when you make a deck, or at least when I make a deck, every archetype has 6 to 8 different mechanical themes. This could be certain buffs, certain playstyles like buffing, debuffing, or rule abuse, or even just specific spells and monsters that the entire deck is built around, if that makes sense. Next up is how difficult is the deck. This one's actually pretty self-explanatory. Is the deck beginner-friendly? Like the Hustlers, you don't have to put a whole lot of thought into how you pull off the optimal combo, because the optimal combo is just one unit, and everyone can play one unit. It's very easy to play. A mid-level deck requires some coordination and some forethought. Like, you have a powerful card in hand, but it can't really be used on its own, so do you just kind of YOLO and play the powerful card anyway? Maybe you kill a couple enemies, or do you want to wait and risk losing a bunch of health in exchange for getting this powerful card out a little bit later? And then hard is generally a lot of late-game decks, because you will need patience, you will need a lot of knowledge about the other decks and your opponent's deck, because you need to understand how much damage your opponent can do in a turn, and how much you can actually take in a turn in order for you to properly budget your health, your resources, and your monsters as a whole. Next up is how compatible is the deck. Now this one is probably the least important metric I have, because not all decks are meant to be super compatible with each other, and some decks are compatible with certain decks but not others, so this one, honestly, you can probably ignore it. But to break it down, how well does it work with other decks? And this essentially comes down to, what are the main goals of the deck? Like, let's take a look at Hustlers, for example. The 3 main goals that they have is end the game as early as possible, be aggressive, and kill enemies. Those are their 3 objectives, whereas if you take something like the Cursed Kingdom or the Forbidden Gods, their main objectives are get out the boss monsters, stall the game as long as possible, and yeah, that's it really. They only have 2 objectives. But the reason why Hustlers and something like the Cursed Kingdom can't really be compatible is because they have such different goals that fundamentally you will either have to sacrifice the power of the late game deck so that you can empower the early game deck, or essentially just make your early game deck completely useless in favor of the more powerful late game decks. And so the deck compatibility really comes down to when does the deck come online, as well as the playstyle, because the playstyle determines the goals, and the time that the deck comes online determines when it is strong, and generally after figuring out those 2 metrics, you will be able to find out if a deck is compatible or not with another deck. Next up is, does the deck use a lot of magic? Like, does it have a lot of spells? Is it reliant on spells? Can you summon monsters using spells? How does it like to use its magic? So, again, like the Hustlers, they don't really care about spells. They just want units out. They want to end the game fast, 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 because they are Hustlers. That's just what they want to do. Whereas if you take something like the Iron Chain Mages, they are all about magic because they are mages. They can't really attack or do anything on their own without the assistance of magic or effects. So that's generally how you determine if a deck is reliant on magic, is if the monsters directly benefit from magic or get enhanced by magic in some way. And finally, how strong are the minions, mids, and masters? Now, these are the 3 M's of deck design, and to break it down, minions are generally your cheap meat shield units. They have the lowest attack, lowest health, and lowest cost of everything else in the deck. Your mids are your 5 to 6 cost units. They have more health, they have more damage, and they generally have better effects than the minions do. And then finally, you have your masters. These are the big boss baddies that will just wipe entire boards by themselves, but again, this all depends on the kind of deck you're playing. For something like the Hustlers, minions, mids, and masters don't really apply because everything is cheap, everything has high attack, and everything has low health, and not very many cards actually have super intricate effects that could turn the tide. Now, the Chronically Online archetype is a little bit of a mix of everything, but is generally considered to be a mid to late game deck. And the reason why is because of its mechanical theme. Generally, the Chronically Online archetype focuses on Brain Rot. Brain Rot is a special mechanic where if an attacking or defending card engages with another opponent and that opponent has an effect, Brain Rot will replace their effect with the Brain Rot effect. So let's say I have an effect, deal 2 damage to my opponent when I attack. If I then engage that card with a card that has Brain Rot, I take 1 damage. Instead of this enemy card dealing 2 damage to me, it will have its Brain Rotted and deal 1 damage to itself because that is the Brain Rot effect. And the reason why that is generally considered a mid to late game effect is because, as we discussed before, the later game cards generally have the strongest effects in the game, and if you can nullify or straight up replace these effects, that is very crippling. That being said, the Chronically Online archetype cards don't really have the best stats. They have some good health pools, don't get me wrong, but their attack it's just not there. In terms of mid and late game cards, it's not there. But the reason why they are so strong is, again, because of Brain Rot, because you can basically turn an effect on its head and use that strength against your opponents. Now, the way that this is countered is because Brain Rot only targets effects. This is not buffs. Buffs are little pictures on the card, which you will see, and these buffs mean something, like attacking the turn it's played, being unable to be blocked, getting something during combat. Brain Rot has absolutely no effect on buffs, and will not do anything against buffs. Additionally, if the card doesn't have an effect, like the Creepy Bear, Brain Rot can't do anything because there's no effect to replace. So, that's why I would put the Chronically Online archetype as a mid to late game, because in the early game, there's not a whole lot of effects you can replace, and again, against something like the Hustlers, who don't really have any effects at all, they're basically useless. And combined with the fact that they have very low, if any, attack stat, it's very hard for them to retaliate, but the longer the game goes on, the more powerful effects become, and the more influential Brain Rot becomes. So, taking a closer look at the minion of the Chronically Online archetype, the NFT. It's useless, don't play it, that's about the only thing that they have for minions. They do have a couple others with the Wojak NPC and the Wojak Angry NPC, which are low-cost units with very low stats and no effect. As far as their mids go, they have basically the entire arsenal at their disposal because they are all considered mids. A vast majority of them have deal with Brain Rot and can disrupt or change enemy effects. A couple cards have Sadistic, which means that they get the certain bonus after they attack, and some cards just don't have an effect but have good stats, mainly like the Creepy Bear. And yeah, that's basically it. You could consider the Yellow Dog as a powerful minion, so to speak, because it has good base stats, it has a decent cost, but it can be empowered with Brain Rot effectiveness, if that makes sense. And unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for this episode. I thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope you like learning more about the design aspect of games as opposed to the coding aspect, because I can certainly do this a whole lot easier, and I certainly enjoy this a lot more, but at the end of the day, do you guys enjoy this a lot more? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow.